your neck in.
True. True. I am. Okay.
Everyone, can I get everyone's attention for 2 seconds? Class council on Wednesday will be hosting round 2 of Job Night, and all proceeds and all earnings will go towards other fun activities for our class and for our formal. So we hope to see everyone there. It's at 10 p.m. at OB, and I made a Facebook event on our Facebook page, so please join and come through. Thanks.
Oh, what time are we at?
We have one more announcement.
Hi everyone, if you guys didn't know, today is actually World Autism Awareness Day. So tonight, APUG is actually hosting an event with Dr. Kumable, who has her own nonprofit autism foundation. So she's going to be talking to us about her personal story with autism, and I hope you guys really come out. It's in room 249, and it will be right after this class, and we have pizza.
So we continue on with the just a page or so of the outline we were dealing with last time. If anybody needs an extra copy, there's some up on the podium there. You can pick them up. But we were on page 5 of that outline, if you recall, and it talked about pharmacy technicians. And let me just read the paragraph as it discusses it. And remember that there are a couple of items related to the legal aspects in New Jersey of pharmacy technicians, which I'm sure you went over with Professor Cifaldi, but are worth reviewing because these are the kind of things that really are emphasized on the MJE exam. So it says, regulatory recognition of pharmacy technicians in New Jersey and elsewhere is an indication of the change in the role of the pharmacist beyond strictly dispensing and distributive kinds of roles. And more direct patient care roles. So the idea is it's supposed to allow extra time for pharmacists to devote to these other kinds of more clinical activities. And the regulations in New Jersey allow the pharmacists to delegate to the pharmacy technicians, as well as interns and externs, only the following duties: recording of the prescriptions, selection of drugs, the containers, that means getting them off the shelf and the diluents, typing of labels, and compounding of preparations. And that goes on, especially the compounding aspects in the hospital setting with sterile compounded products. But then it goes on to say that the pharmacist has to ensure each task has been performed correctly in the dispensing process. The pharmacist shall provide immediate personal supervision of technicians who are performing sterile and non-sterile compounding. The ratio of pharmacists to technicians shall not exceed 1 to 2 unless the technician has been certified on the certification exam, in which case it can go beyond that. And the only place where that would probably have relevance would be in the hospital settings. So this whole issue of pharmacy technicians has implications, certainly in one case, for the job demand for pharmacists, because it's no secret that probably the use of technicians has meant that in most pharmacies, even in busy times, you're only going to have one pharmacist there rather than 2. So it has somewhat of a negative impact there, unavoidable though it may be. And we also would note that based on these regulations, getting a license as a pharmacy technician is not linked to necessarily having a job as a pharmacy technician. You can be licensed as a pharmacy technician without having a job, but if you do get hired as a pharmacy technician, legally you have to apply within 10 days to become licensed in New Jersey, and probably similar kinds of requirements elsewhere. And it has to be completed, the whole process, within 180 days of the time that you were hired. So another item that the pharmacists in New Jersey, based on regulations, can do is that they have the option to change the dosage form. So this would be a situation where a patient would come in and would be getting, let's say, solid dosage forms of an antibiotic. And the patient might say, oh, I can't swallow a tablet or a capsule that large. The pharmacist, independently of the physician, can change it with the patient's concurrence, of course, to a liquid dosage form. It would be obviously more easy to swallow. Or that could be for a child as well, that could occur. You'd have to be sure that you're giving the same dose of the active ingredient, of course. And there is a requirement that the pharmacist notify the physician, not in advance, but within 48 hours of having made this switch. And that could be done by email. The regulation also indicates that the pharmacist should be attentive to any potential bioavailability differences. I think pharmacists would have the instincts to do that. It's interesting to note that pharmacists have in general not taken full advantage of that. And I've asked around sometimes why pharmacists are reluctant to do it, and they indicate things like, well, the corporation, the chain, might feel that it would add to liabilities and that sort of thing. But certainly pharmacists should be more aggressive in taking those kinds of options, and taking advantage of those, of doing things independently. And sort of just to back that up, in those several states that we've mentioned, like California and Colorado and Oregon and New Mexico and Vermont and so forth, where pharmacists can prescribe oral contraceptives under certain conditions independently, pharmacists have not taken full advantage of that. The studies have shown that while some do, the majority probably do not. So it's a signal for us to have to be a little bit more proactive and aggressive in a way in taking on some of these independent roles might otherwise be limited to a physician's involvement. Another action in the sector of the state regulations, and here we're referring to New Jersey, that really shows implications for the change in the way we practice and all the ethical implications that go along with that, has to do with the types of practice sites that are eligible to get a permit in New Jersey. And if you look at the bullet items there, the first four items, intake, central processing, EUR, central fill pharmacy, and dispensing pharmacy, they would be the four functions that any traditional pharmacy would ordinarily carry out. But now, increasingly, those functions are being specialized functions in a specific pharmacy, and the state board does allow that. The last one, under consideration is by the New Jersey Board of Pharmacy, remote processing of prescriptions. And actually, this has now been approved, at least based on testing it out. They're allowed to at least test it out in New Jersey. So this is sort of a sign of the times as well. What that means is that, for example, in a smaller hospital that could not justify having a regular outpatient pharmacy present in as many larger hospitals do, that they have a machine, almost like a vending machine. And it contains all of the common prescription products already packaged that would ordinarily be written for example, in that hospital's emergency room. And the patient can go to that device and submit the written prescription. It automatically reads it, the prescription, and will dispense it after it's shown to a pharmacist somewhere in the vicinity or in the chain that operates this device. And also it has a screen so that the patient can actually see and talk on the screen, of course, to a pharmacist for counseling and any questions that they may have. So this is something that is referred to as remote dispensing, or a remote type of pharmacy services, or it's also referred to as telepharmacy, similar to telemedicine, the remote provision of medical services as well as now pharmaceutical services on these devices. So you see how times are changing. Then finally on that page it talks about out-of-state mail order pharmacies, and all that means is that in New Jersey, at least, if a mail-order pharmacy that's out of state is mailing prescriptions into the state, they have to be registered with the Board of Pharmacy. So they would actually have to register and pay the fees and so forth with the Board of Pharmacy. On the last page of that outline, so we can finish it off, it talks about the size and composition of the New Jersey Board of Pharmacy. These were all changes that were made in the updated Pharmacy Practice Act that we talked about. The specifics in New Jersey are that there have to be 8 pharmacists on the board, 8 pharmacists, and they have to be pharmacists who obviously are licensed in New Jersey, and they have to have been licensed for a minimum of 5 years in New Jersey. So within 5 or 6 years from now, some of you folks will be eligible, and I'm sure will end up being on these boards. The board also has 3 non-pharmacist members, and they represent consumers of the state government to sort of, I guess in a way keep the pharmacists honest on the board. And while it's not written into the regulations, usually the 8 pharmacists would be selected in a way that they would represent the major specialty areas of pharmacy, like an independent pharmacist, a chain pharmacist, a hospital pharmacist certainly, and then certain others, now increasingly managed care and things like that would come into play. Next it says medication administration, especially immunization by pharmacists, and we know that the regulations in New Jersey and in every other state now allow for the administration, direct administration to the patient of drugs and especially immunizations, which as we said have been very successful, have been widely accepted by patients, and certainly is an indication that patients are ready to accept direct patient care services from pharmacists. But while the specifics of the regulations do vary from state to state, some of the specifics that relate to New Jersey are that, first of all, really on the good side, in New Jersey, there's no limitation as to which immunizations you can give. Some states will just limit which immunizations can be given. In New Jersey, it's just about any vaccine. It does specify that the routes of administration that can be used, the parenteral routes of administration, are all of the routes that you know about, with the exception of IV. They do not authorize the administration of IV, but that's fairly rare that you'd be using IV administration anyway for an immunization. So IM and subcutaneous and intradermal and so forth would be perfectly okay. The other general restriction that we certainly know off by heart, I'm sure, is that we're limited to patients who are 18 years of age and up, although there's some exceptions to that for the influenza vaccine, where you can administer it under certain circumstances to patients from 7 years of age up to 18. There are certain restrictions that obviously you would need to have parental consent. You couldn't be giving immunizations to children without their parents consenting to it. From the age 7 to 11, from 7 to 11, you also need an actual prescription. This paragraph talks about provider status in California. I'm going to leave that to you. This is under active pursuit at the state level, at all states, as well as at the federal level to get this. And the real ultimate outcome of it is that more than anything else, it will facilitate reimbursement for direct patient care services, including MTM, including that. I just read very recently, the last couple of days, that Colorado has enacted some kind of legislation related to this kind of thing. And you'll see this going on at other states as well. And then it mentions again about the move to have pharmacists be able to independently prescribe oral contraceptives, and that is also something under active consideration at a number of states, including the ones that are listed here. As New Hampshire was recently added to that list as well. And the last part of the page we went over last time, so I don't think we need to say anything more about that. But let's go on to the page, the outline for today, which really does cover a lot of important principles that we're trying to convey in this series of classes. So it talks about at the heading there, the application of professional ethics to things like ethical dilemmas, and toward the latter part of this outline, very importantly, to go over the theoretical approaches to ethical decision making, which we'll probably finish up next time. It begins by talking about, in New Jersey, what have been listed in the state regulations as, quote, examples of grossly unprofessional, meaning unethical, of course, conduct, which can incur penalties for pharmacists in New Jersey. What I really want to point out with regard to this is how, over time, the significance and the applicability of these various kinds of restrictions and regulations change considerably. And you'll see that as we go through this. These are the things that, at least in New Jersey, by their regulations, they consider grossly unprofessional conduct for pharmacists. One of them is fairly obvious. It's called paying rebates for entry into an agreement for payment or rebates, so-called kickback schemes, where you would have an arrangement with a doctor, a prescriber, a clinic, or something like that, to just send all your prescriptions to me, and I'll give you a kickback of whatever, $1 or whatever it is for every prescription to me. That's obviously unethical, and by this regulation also illegal. This is sometimes referred to by the term steering, and steering is viewed as unethical. One example of that in the past was that before we had the New Jersey state regulated prescription blanks, it used to be a courtesy, sort of, an advertisement in a sense of certain pharmacies, particularly independent pharmacies, to say to a doctor in the area, I'll provide you prescription pads to write your prescriptions on, free, and the only thing I'm asking is at the back of the prescription, it's going to have a little logo and an address and telephone number of my pharmacy. Well, there was a lot of that went on, but it ultimately was viewed as being unethical because some patients thought, even though it wasn't true, they thought that meant when they saw that on the back of the prescription that was the only pharmacy you could bring that prescription to. That was never the case, but people had that perception in some cases, so it's pretty much frowned upon now. Now it's not applicable in New Jersey because you have to have the state mandated prescription blanks. But this business of not allowing steering, to show you how this has changed also over time, if we really strictly interpreted this, you would wonder how things like the REMS mandated drugs, where you can only get them through very specific specialty pharmacies, or the insurance company almost restricts you to a specific specialty pharmacy, that would almost be an example of steering. Also, attempts to either highly incentivize or actually mandate that you get your prescriptions from their mail order pharmacy in a PBM, that would be an example of that goes on all the time, that you could interpret as this type of steering. So we see that over time, the ability to really apply some of these restrictions changes quite a bit. So another example of what the State Board has considered grossly unprofessional conduct is, well, we already went over it, providing the prescription blanks and so forth that has the pharmacy's name or logo. Then claiming professional superiority. So that if you have a pharmacy, or even if it's a chain pharmacy, and you were to advertise, we fill prescriptions more accurately than other pharmacies, or even if you just say we fill our prescriptions accurately, it sort of implies that maybe not everybody does, and that could be viewed as unprofessional. I saw an example of that a few years ago, in which the then PBM called Medco, some of you may remember that name, it was a PBM actually headquartered here in northern New Jersey, that was subsequently bought out by Express Scripts. But when Medco was an independent PBM, they had some people that would go around and meet with the various pharmaceutical associations and tout the wonders of that PBM. And this one pharmacist was present at one of the meetings of the professional associations, and she talked about the Medco's then new automated prescription filling center that's located in Willingboro, New Jersey. If you've ever seen it, it's totally automated, and they put out all these mail order prescriptions. I'm sure now it's run by Express Scripts. But she said that we showed that the number of errors, the percentage of errors in the prescriptions filled in our mail order automated pharmacy is much less, far less than what goes on in other pharmacies. And she was particularly implying that the independently owned pharmacies. Well, some of the independent pharmacies got, of course, upset by this, and they really approached the board and demanded to her to show them the data. Show us the data, because they said, we don't know that there's any data showing what the error rate is in the other pharmacies. You may have data about what the error rate is in your mail order pharmacy, but let me show the actual numbers. And she didn't have that. So it was really a big brouhaha and an embarrassment for them. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, claiming professional superiority. Next it says, distribution of premiums or rebates of any kind whatsoever in connection with prescription. However, I would point out there are many exceptions to this where coupons are used and that sort of thing. But I do notice, for example, those of you who work for Walgreens or who go to a Walgreens pharmacy, Walgreens has this card. What do they call it? Some kind of a card where you, what's that? Well, they have a card that, yeah, Balance Rewards it's called. Thank you, Balance Rewards. And when you're buying like all this stuff out in the front of the pharmacy, once you accumulate a certain number of sales of items, you get like a $5 back or $10 back, in your next store or whatever it is. But I noticed that on when you get prescriptions filled there, although they'll maybe mark the card or record it, it doesn't count toward that bonus. And I guess that's related to this regulation about unprofessional conduct. They don't want to get into trouble with regard to that. Next, it talks about advertising prescription drug prices in a manner inconsistent with rules or regulations promulgated by the Director of the Division of Consumer Affairs. This is the New Jersey State Government Department under which the Board of Pharmacy here is headquartered. In some states it's under the Department of Health. Here it's under the Division of Consumer Affairs. And originally, although this no longer applies, originally any advertising of prescription drug prices was viewed as grossly unprofessional. But this began to be challenged legally in the courts, and those who challenged it tended to win. So now they can't really stop the advertising of prescription prices. To show you how, based on laws and so forth, perceptions change. In fact, now, pharmacists are required, every pharmacy is required to maintain a list. You don't have to post it or anything, but you have to maintain a list of the 150 most commonly prescribed drugs in that pharmacy with the prices, so that if somebody demanded, I don't know if anybody ever would, but if somebody ever came in and said, I want to see your list of 150, legally you're supposed to show it to them. So it shows you how this business of what was once considered grossly unprofessional wouldn't be a practical thing to enforce today. And then finally, engaging in activities beyond the scope of a collaborative drug therapy management program. So that would mean, for example, if you're in a collaborative MTM program and you begin to initiate prescriptions, that would be against their rules. Next heading, which goes on for quite a while, talks about some areas of practical application of professional ethics. And it says that in terms of being healthcare providers, patient relationships start with meaningful, practical, and ethical patient counseling. So patient counseling is really a very important aspect of providing good relationships with patients, particularly in the hospital, in the community pharmacy, because in hospital pharmacies it's more difficult to really bring about this regular, ongoing patient counseling because it's mostly handled by nurses, the drug administration. But there is some options for that, where pharmacists can get involved in that, where pharmacists can get involved in the discharge counseling. Both the inpatient pharmacist and then if the hospital has an outpatient pharmacy, that they can get involved in that too. Healthcare systems and economic viability. The economic viability of the systems you work for and also the corporations you work for is important. And so ethically, you should minimize waste because, as I said, your employer is not the enemy. You're trying to reduce costs wherever possible and unnecessary duplication. Pharmacists and Medicare regulations, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services requires pharmacists who are involved in Medicare and Medicaid programs to complete some form of training on an annual basis. This may be handled through the Medicare plan sponsors like the PDPs, the Prescription Drug Program sponsors for the Medicaid programs, or by state Medicaid review boards. So this is often handled through the insurance companies and PBMs or through the company you work for. And a lot of it is this training can be completed online, but it is an ongoing requirement. To continue with that idea, it talks about this CMS requirement for fraud, waste, and abuse training, because they've noticed that there was a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse with regard to Medicare and Medicaid prescriptions, and of course the federal government doesn't like that. These are all ethical issues. So the training has to include concerns about inappropriate billing, intentional shorting, that obviously shorting the number of pills in a bottle is clearly unethical, although some pharmacists have been caught doing that. Inappropriate pricing, intentional forging or altering of prescriptions, and dispensing expired medications, all of those. But there are many examples of pharmacists as well as corporations who are fined substantially, especially some of the big corporations are fined substantially for things like overcharging for Medicare and Medicaid prescriptions. Another area of some aspects of practical applications of ethics has to do with the whole area of fertility and human reproduction. We mentioned this in the introductory lecture as well, and it involves medications for things like contraception and emergency contraception. We had, a case study dealing with that. And note that some of these regulations relating to fertility and human reproduction and abortion and so forth do differ from one state to another. So you have to be a little attentive to the specifics of the state where you're practicing. Other kind of drugs that come under this area of concern would be any abortive drugs, abortifacients. Also, any drugs used in fertility clinics, and that tends to come under the domain of specialty pharmacy. These drugs for fertility clinics, drugs for example, involved with in vitro fertilization and fertility in general. And then also, it also would involve concerns about counseling patients on taking drugs during pregnancy, because we know that there are many drugs that taken during pregnancy can lead to birth defects. It's worth noting that pharmacists differ considerably, though, in their views, often based on their religious convictions, of what drugs can ethically be dispensed in this area of fertility and human reproduction. And in general, court cases over the last few years have indicated that pharmacists really have to dispense these medications, but the Trump administration and the Republicans in general tend to have a different view, and the Trump administration is actually attempting to develop legislation that will give pharmacists and others, doctors of course as well, the right to refuse to participate in things like abortion and some of these other aspects of fertility and human reproduction based on their religious beliefs. So we'll see how that goes, and obviously it's an area that there's some controversy about. Another practical area of applicability of ethics has to do with death and end-of-life experiences. And number one on the list there is assisted suicide, also called euthanasia, also called aid in dying. Some of these tend to be more euphemistic ways because they don't like the word suicide, so they call it aid in dying and assisted dying and things like that. But it's legal in a number of countries, and it's also legal in several states. The majority of states, it's illegal. So, for example, in New Jersey, if you get involved in this stuff, you could get into big trouble by being, prosecuted for murder, actually. But there are a growing number of states where it is legal for this assisted suicide. And I'd like to just mention those states. Those states are California, you've heard of it, I'm sure, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Vermont, Colorado, and D.C. And like I said, even in New Jersey, I know that there's an ongoing pressure to allow this to be legal in New Jersey, but at the present time it is not. So this kind of assisted dying, or euthanasia, or whatever you want to call it, is really legal in states that cover about 20% of the population of the United States. So it's not a rare or insignificant kind of occurrence. And of course, pharmacists get involved in this by having to dispense the drugs that are used to carry out these kinds of assisted suicide. Now, it's important to note that there is first of all, let me just say that don't get involved in this in a state where it's not legal, because you could then clearly be prosecuted, especially by people who believe that this is a wrong thing to be doing. But in those states where it is legal, they have provisions in the state regulations that say physicians and also pharmacists are protected against any prosecution for dispensing or for prescribing or administering these drugs. So in those states where it's legal, you're really protected, even if somebody would then try to sue you as a result of that. It's worth noting that there, particularly ethically, but even legally, there's a significant difference between a patient refusing life-sustaining treatment. Okay, there's a big difference between a patient who says, I don't want life-sustaining treatment, and assisted suicide. They're two different things. They're two different things altogether, so you have to be able to distinguish which one you're involved in. Very often some of the drugs that are used for this purpose are in the class, by the way, of barbiturate drugs. The next item there, related to death and life experiences, has to do with nutritional support and hydration therapy. And there are a lot of ethical questions, not so much legal questions, but a lot of ethical questions surrounding the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, including antibiotics. But this is different from assisted suicide. It's usually something that is indicated or demanded or recommended by the patient or the patient's family. Now, it has to be the patient who wants to do this, unless the patient is not mentally competent. If it can be shown that the patient is not mentally competent, then others could make that decision. And we're usually here talking about patients who are terminally ill. We'll be mentioning the concept of advanced directives, also called living wills, which sometimes can be very helpful in these situations. But it's always a good idea to be consulting with the family members in cases like that, if there is an advanced directive or a living will. Third, in this death and life experience area, has to do with dealing with extremely expensive drug therapy. There are various drugs and the ethical issues surrounding these very, very expensive drugs, and some of the ethical issues relate to how the pharmaceutical industry is able to price these drugs at such high, and some would say exorbitant, prices. And of course, the industry has the reasons for this, but we know that in some cases it's impossible for the patients to really, or the insurance companies to pay for it. So this becomes more of an ethical issue from the pharmaceutical industry than it is for pharmacists. It turns out, though, that drug spending in general is becoming more of an issue because it's increasing significantly. U.S. pharmaceutical spending in the United States, on a per capita basis, the last time it was calculated, which was 2015, is $1,443. So that's, when you take, that's the average for every man, woman, and child in the U.S., that's a lot of money, and we can see we're talking about a lot of money. And it turns out that the use of drugs in all venues, in all the places where drugs are used, pharmacies, hospitals, clinicians' offices, all that kind of thing, now, in the most recent calculation, makes up 16.7% of total healthcare spending. 16.7% of total healthcare spending. The pharmaceutical industry, in trying to justify how low the prices for drugs are, has in the past been very proud of saying that prescription drugs only make up 10% of total healthcare spending. Now that was also always misleading, because that only was, the 10% only related to outpatient prescription drug filling. It did not include drugs used in hospitals, it did not include drugs used in clinics and that sort of thing. But this 16.7% is a better estimate, and the number has been going up, so it's been going up more and more, and really it seems to be approaching 20%, which is a lot in terms of, because hospitals are the biggest portion of that. That's about 30%. Physician charges about 30%, and so forth. Also, specialty drugs, which is the area that's growing most rapidly, and the drugs that are especially costly, really now account for about a third of total drug spending. Actually more, it's at least a third of total drug spending is for these specialty drugs. So that's one of the areas where the costs are increasing a lot. Next, it talks about psychological and behavioral health, ethical approaches to the treatment of chemically impaired patients, especially in regard to dependence prescriptions, especially patients addicted to the narcotic analgesics, and also dealing with patients with psychological diseases and the use of pharmacotherapy in treating depression and mental illness. There are a lot of ethical issues with regard to that. And ethically, there is an effort to try to reduce the excess use, the excessive use of anti-psych drugs, or the so-called psych drugs, in nursing homes. Because it turns out that it's been found that more than 50% of patients in nursing homes tend to be on one of these psych drugs, whether it's an anti-anxiety drug or the various types of tranquilizers, the whole line of the drugs in that category, things like chlorpromazine, the older drugs, and newer drugs, and so forth, quietiapine, and so forth. And of course, even the use of things like benzodiazepines is heavily used in benzodiazepines heavily used in nursing homes. And the reason for that is that some of these folks in the nursing homes tend to give the nurses and others in there kind of a hard time. If you've ever worked in a nursing home, you'd probably see that. So these personnel are all too happy to keep these patients on these kind of medications to keep them, quiet and tranquilized and so forth. But it's unethical to do that. Another area of practical application of ethical principles has to do with investigational drugs and clinical research. And of course, the important thing there is that any patients involved in clinical trials have to be involved there based on informed consent. And it's necessary when you're conducting or being involved in any clinical trial to give full disclosure to the volunteers using this legally required document called a Statement of Informed Consent, which fully explains the risks, benefits, and all the procedures that are being carried out. It has to be signed by the volunteers, by the participants and witness. So this is essentially an ethical mandate and requirement. And of course, that ethical committee of the Institutional Review Board would look at that statement to see that it's involved with full disclosure, veracity, and all that kind of thing. Obviously, ethical issues involving fabrication of results would obviously be a violation of veracity and would be unethical. And there would be legal risks associated with that as well. In some clinical trials, there has been this procedure called data mining, where you keep applying one statistical test after another to ultimately get the data to somehow fit what you're trying to prove. And that is unethical, rather than just trying to see what the actual results are. Full disclosure of results of clinical trials, the FDA is now being more attentive to being sure that the full results of ethical trials, of investigational drug trials, both negative results, meaning that it doesn't prove what you're trying to prove, or adverse effects, that they have to be disclosed. They have to be disclosed. Whether it's part of the process of building up to the new drug application, or if it's part of the post-marketing surveillance, the FDA is wanting full disclosure. So when trials are conducted and the results show that the drug doesn't work, or it's not superior to the existing available treatments, that has to be made publicly available. Another area for the practical application of ethical principles has to do with organ transplantation. Pharmacists are now routinely part of transplant teams in hospitals. Routinely, any hospital that does transplants has a pharmacist as a specialist on that team. As far as I know, it's not yet a recognized board-certified specialty, but it in the future might be. But at any rate, it certainly is a specialty area for clinical pharmacists in hospitals. And some of the things that pharmacists in that area would be involved in would be in making decisions to prioritize which patients get scarce organs. Which patients get scarce organs. Pharmacists wouldn't do that alone, but they would be involved in that decision. And that would deal with the ethical principle of justice that we talked about. It would be, you'd take into consideration a lot of different factors in determining who would get those when they're limited. Age, likelihood of getting, for example, an alcoholic, of becoming alcoholic again and wasting the transplanted organ, their ability to pay, all of those issues. And the pharmacist's most important ethical implication, requirement here would be in ensuring the patient's adherence to the immunosuppressant regimen, the anti-rejection drugs, the immunosuppressant drugs. The pharmacist would want to ethically be required to do everything possible to see that patients are adhering to that, so you're not wasting these very precious and limited organs. Animal experimentation, which most of you probably won't be involved in, but here there are strict requirements that relate both to ethics and legal requirements concerning the humane treatment of experimental animals. And we won't go into detail there because I don't think it's an area that pharmacists are heavily involved in for the most part. On the third page of this outline, it talks about the increasing exposure of pharmacists to ethical dilemmas. And this is where pharmacists have to use that process that we talked about of EDM, ethical decision making. The ethical dilemmas are defined here as complex or controversial decisions or problems involving conflicting interests among multiple stakeholders. And we pointed out that the multiple stakeholders often have conflicting interests. And you have to work that out in the ethical decision making. The reasons for pharmacists increasing exposure to ethical dilemmas, we can cite 4 reasons why we're being increasingly exposed to this issue of ethical dilemmas. First of all, pharmacists are involved in more patient counseling, so that when you get involved in patient counseling, believe it or not, even though that's the thing you're supposed to be doing, you increase your legal liability, but there are also ethical obligations to do it as well. It would be unethical to say, well, I'm not going to ever counsel so that would minimize any legal risk I would get from doing the counseling. Secondly, pharmacists have increased involvement in direct patient care. We've talked about that a lot, not only the immunizations, but in many states, legislation that enhances the ability of pharmacists to be involved in direct patient care. Third would be the involvement in MTM, And fourth would be because of the increasing costs and complexity of pharmacotherapy, All of those factors increase our exposure to getting involved in ethical dilemmas. Now, question you might ask, and this leads into the final part of this whole outline here, is why can't pharmacists just rely on their emotional or experience-based reactions to resolving such problems? And some students have told me that, frankly. They've said, I don't know why we have to talk about ethics because I just use my gut reactions and my common sense, and you can figure it all out from that. Well, there's a certain amount of truth. Common sense is always a helpful thing to have. And some of us have better, gut reactions than others probably. But the main reason why you can't just rely on that way of doing it is that it leads to too much variability. It leads to too much variability. Because, you know, we're all individuals. We come from different backgrounds. We have different political leanings, different philosophical beliefs, different religious kinds of training and feelings and so forth. And so having a little bit of a more formalized approach to solving ethical dilemmas is better. So it says the more professional approach to resolving such dilemmas is less reliance on just the experience, background, and personal philosophy of the pharmacist. Instead, use a more systematic approach based on ethical principles and theories, which we go into here, 6 of them, allowing pharmacists to utilize various alternative theoretical approaches to resolving ethical problems. Now, these 6 theoretical basis as to how people solve ethical problems are not something that you would consciously necessarily say, now let me list the 6 and which one am I going to use. No, it's sort of, they pretty much automatically come, and that's why we want to discuss them, to see what is the basis on which people make ethical decisions, whether they do it consciously or automatically or unconsciously. And you would either use one or a combination of these theories, again, either explicitly or implicitly, in any decision ethically that you're making. So the first of these 6 that's mentioned here is called the social contract theory. So let's just read what that theory is about. I think you'll get the point. It says, because pharmacists are licensed healthcare professionals, society in general, as well as patients, have a fundamental right or contract. That's why it's called a contract, even though it's not a formal written contract, it's an implied contract, to automatically assume and expect a competent and supportive professional relationship with a pharmacist. And this is, of course, true of doctors and other healthcare professionals. It is not based on a legal or written contract, but on the norms of acceptable professional ethical conduct. So, for example, a patient has a right to expect that a pharmacist will not intentionally short count their prescription. That's part of this idea of a social contract. They would have a right to expect that. Or to, as some, in rare cases, pharmacists have done, to dilute out their injectable solutions, either to make more money by just substituting expensive medications with saline, or to withdraw some of the drug because they're addicted to the drug and replace it with saline. So you know, obviously patients would have a right to expect that kind of thing not to happen. The second of these 6 theories is called the ethics of care theory, and here it is sort of important that we go into some detail. It says this is an ethical theory that applies uniquely to healthcare professionals. It assumes that healthcare professionals have an inherent natural instinct and emotional inclination to provide quality health care. So in other words, it says if you're going into a healthcare field, maybe unlike somebody who's majoring in business or going into engineering or whatever, that you would have some instinct to want to benefit patients. The idea of beneficence and non-maleficence, not hurt patients. You would have a natural instinct for that, otherwise you may be in the wrong field. But although pharmacists and other healthcare professionals have this approach and this instinct, there are clearly 2 different forms of it depending on the individual variability of the pharmacist or the physician. And they deal with these areas of consequentialism and non-consequentialism. So let's explain what they are. Consequentialism is defined here as the end justifies the means. And this is also called relativism. Here, if the pharmacist is oriented in this way in this second theory, the focus is strictly on the outcomes or the consequences of decisions, Everything depends on the ultimate benefit or the ultimate harm to the patient. Everything depends on that. Or to one of the other stakeholders. If it's not the patient, it would be one of the other stakeholders. So by this approach, for example, a good illustration of this, by this approach, it would be perfectly okay to use placebo therapy for patients. It would be okay. Because, you know, if you don't want to have a patient on a tranquilizer or an antidepressant, but you want them to think you do, you give them a placebo medication. And if it works, then hey, they say, oh, this pill worked great, you know. Even though it's a placebo, if you're a relativist, you would say, fine, no, the problem solved, you know. It doesn't matter that I was really, in a sense, lying to the patient by giving you a medication that doesn't have any active ingredients in it. So you get the idea that the success in this theory depends on the outcome. Extreme consequentialism is referred to as moral relativism. An extreme version of that would be if I decide that, I'm going to cheat on an exam or whatever other kind of cheating in the life of a pharmacist you would be involved in, as long as I don't get caught, if I cheat on the exam and I don't get caught at it, everything is okay. So that would be an extreme example, carrying it really to an absurd extreme. The other approach in this theory is the non-consequentialism, also called absolutism, where the end never justifies the means. And this is a more conservative philosophy. So people who happen to be more conservative by nature, even more politically conservative, would tend to more align with this aspect here. So this approach, for example, emphasizes full disclosure. Full disclosure would be emphasized here. Also, maximum autonomy. Maximum autonomy to the patient would also be emphasized in this approach. So in this approach, placebo therapy would never be acceptable. Even if it produces a good result, it would never be acceptable. Extreme application of this idea is referred to as absolutism, as you can see there, where there are simply no exceptions. So for example, in that extreme position, a person might even say that in controlled clinical trials, you can't use a placebo, even though statistically it's very helpful to use a placebo to show that one treatment is working and one isn't. So, in these cases, you can go to one extreme in either case. I think a really good summary there is what's printed here, and this would be a really good summary for pharmacists. It says, most pharmacists tend to be, and need to be, neither ethical absolutists or ethical relativists. Rather, they need to be ethical realists. Because there is a relative quality to most ethical decisions. So some degree of flexibility is needed, but not to be carried to excess. So, we have to sort of be balancing, it's not that easy, between consequentialism and non-consequentialism. The third of these 6 theories has to do with the traditional and fundamental ethical principles and values theory, where you simply talk about adhering to the basic ethical values, which becomes the basis of ethical decision making. We've talked about these values, but let me say another word about a few of them. Beneficence. Beneficence, of course, refers to the best interest of the patient taking precedence over other things. The best interest of the patient is what takes precedence. Even though you do have to take into account other stakeholders, but the patient is the principal stakeholder because the patient, by very nature of being a patient, is vulnerable due to their disease, due to a lot of times they don't really understand, many patients don't understand the intricacies, the details, the science behind the drugs that we are using to treat them with. So this means that the pharmacist, under this rubric of beneficence, has to be a patient advocate. Really, even though he or she is a patient advocate, he does have to take into account the effects on the other stakeholders. On the top of the next page, it talks about the thing that is always balanced with beneficence, and that's non-maleficence. And the pharmacists obviously have to protect patients from ineffective medicines. You want to protect patients from medicines that are not effective, and you also have to protect them as much as you can from ADRs. But since all drugs carry some potential adverse possibility, our job is to have that risk-to-benefit ratio worked out. Hopefully in every decision we make in administering a drug, the benefit outweighs the risk, even though there's some risk there. This non-maleficence brings into account something that comes up in court cases sometimes, referred to as the pharmacist's duty to warn. So non-maleficence is the basis of the pharmacist's so-called duty to warn. Duty to warn about what? About adverse effects. Also about the effects of not using the drug at all and skipping the drug and so forth, or skipping the dose. So this is an important ethical concept, and it really is part of what we call informed consent, because any time a patient takes a drug, they're consenting to take it on the basis of being informed. It's an informed consent. Or if they refuse to take the drug, it's got to be an informed refusal, so they know what the risks of not taking the drug would be. And that comes into the harm of do no harm. Excessive emphasis of non-maleficence can get patients to not use drugs, and their informed refusal would be a problem. You know, I was talking to a lady yesterday at an event we went to celebrate the holiday, and she was a lady probably, I would guess, in her 60s, seemed to be overweight, and I was talking to her about the importance of checking your blood pressure and taking the medications, and I asked her if she checks her blood pressure. She said it's usually in the 140 range, you know, the systolic pressure. And I said, well, you know, by today's rubrics, that's kind of high. You should think about, you know, going on one of the blood pressure medications. Oh, no, you know, she right away said, I don't want to be on any of those medications. They have bad effects and all this kind of stuff. Well, you know, pharmacists sort of use that in quite a different way, because the effects of getting a stroke or a heart attack is worse than any of the effects that these drugs would have, which are largely pretty non-harmful drugs for the most part. Anyway, that's the point of the harm of do no harm. So legal reasons for not filling a prescription also comes under this area of non-maleficence. Now, I'm sure that Professor Cifaldi went over the legal reasons for not filling a prescription, but this is something that has both legal or regulatory as well as ethical implications. So I do want to go over the three reasons why in New Jersey, and it's not too different in other states, the three reasons that you have the right to refuse to fill a prescription, and really only these reasons to refuse to fill. And this is a right that you have, but it has to be carefully exercised. You don't want to overdo this exercising your right to not fill a prescription. The first reason is that it's outside the scope of practice. So we know that, for example, if a dentist prescribes cardiovascular drugs or neurological drugs, anti-seizure drugs or Parkinson's drugs or something like that, that's really outside the scope of a dentist. And so you should ethically not fill it. Legally, you could legally fill it. And I know stories where a dentist, once there was a dentist who sent a lot of prescriptions to a particular pharmacy, and one of the pharmacists who happened to be working in that pharmacy got a prescription from the dentist, and it was for some sort of a cardiovascular drug that had to do with regulating the patient's rhythm of the heart. And the pharmacist questioned it, and the patient said, this dentist is a relative of mine, and so rather than me having to go to the cardiologist or whoever to get it, he just writes this for me. Well, the pharmacist refused to fill it, and certainly was within his legal and certainly ethical right to do that. But the dentist got so upset that he refused to send any more prescriptions to that pharmacy. So that, you can see when we talk about these dilemmas and how complicated it becomes. Then another reason to refuse to fill would be questionable validity. This especially deals with controlled substance drugs where you have reason to question the validity of the prescription. Here too, you don't want to overdo this because, like I've said many times, we are not the police force. And we have to be sensitive to the fact that there are many patients who really do have legitimate needs for pain relief. Not every patient who's getting a controlled substance opioid is a drug addict. So you have to exercise all of these rights cautiously, a refusal to fill. The third reason is to protect the health and welfare of the patient. This gives you a lot of latitude in why you would refuse to fill. But for example, if you really feel it's the wrong drug or that the dose is unreasonable, I've run into cases where I thought the dose was totally unreasonable, checked with the doctor said, no, that's what I want. And in one case, I refused to fill it because it just was a ludicrous dose. And long story short, later on, the doctor contacted me and thanked me for catching that and not filling it because it was the wrong dose, in fact. Also, if you have a potentially severe allergy where you wouldn't want to dispense the drug if you know the patient has a severe allergy. Or if you really legitimately, and don't overreact here, but if you legitimately feel the patient is becoming addicted, you could, refuse to fill. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do that in the case of somebody who's terminally ill. That wouldn't be an issue. And then it says some states add a fourth reason, and that is that the drug is not for a legitimate medical purpose. So this would mean a drug that you think is being used for recreational purposes. But this should not be used as a reason to not fill prescriptions for the opioid withdrawal medications like buprenorphine or any of the products related to opioid withdrawal. It should not be used as an excuse not to fill those kinds of prescriptions. And as I said, using this as a reason, in many court cases it's been shown that the pharmacist does not have a right to refuse to do it simply based on his or her religious beliefs, but the Trump administration has a different view, and we'll have to see where this turns out. Another area of, that relates to this whole idea of using basic ethical values or virtues, as they're called, or principles as a theoretical guideline for making ethical decisions has to do with justice or distributive justice. This is one of the newer principles, newer in the sense that it doesn't go back all the way to the Oath of Hippocrates and so forth. But it's especially relevant in pharmacy because we deal with products. And these products are limited. All healthcare services and so forth are limited to some extent. The products particularly can be limited. They can be limited because of the very high costs of these products, especially some of the newer products that have really exorbitantly high, thousands and thousands of dollars of cost, as well as shortages. Shortages is another reason why this whole issue of justice is important for us. There's also the term procedural justice. Procedural justice. And procedural justice differs a little bit from distributive justice in that procedural justice means that the process for making decisions, about products, about which products and who gets products, that has to be fair and just. It has to be a fair process, the way in which you make these decisions. Some of the practical problems that we deal with in this area of justice include these items: shortages, as I mentioned, shortages. Also, the patient's ability to pay. What do you do when a patient can't pay? Well, one ethical option is not an ethical option to just say, not my problem. You can't pay, you don't get the drug. That's not an ethical option. You have to try some way. That doesn't mean you have to pay for it yourself or you have to give it to them free. But you have to see if the company has some process whereby they'll provide medications in hardship cases like that. We'll talk a little bit more about the details of that if we get time. And then another aspect of this justice area would be hospitals where you don't have a really effective or efficient distribution system, where you don't have an effective distribution system, getting the drugs to the patients who are critically ill and need these drugs right away. Another more modern principle that doesn't appear in the Oath of Hippocrates is autonomy. And this means that the pharmacists have to respect the patient's right to make decisions regarding their pharmacotherapy. This is a newer thing. In the Oath of Hippocrates, which was viewed as very paternalistic, it was all up to the doctor or whoever the healthcare provider was to make those decisions. The patient was just a sort of an uninvolved bystander. But in recent years, particularly with the growth of the consumer movement and so forth, patients have a right to, and really should, participate in decisions about their pharmacotherapy, because when they participate in it, it's more likely that they'll be adherent to the pharmacotherapy. But to ethically allow the patients to have this right of autonomy, you have to be sure that the patient is competent. The patient is competent. So if there's some dementia or some mental deficiency where the patient is not competent, then there's other approaches you have to take. So the patients have a right to refuse to take the therapy. But again, it has to be informed refusal. So they have to be informed if they refuse, or for that matter, if they accept, they have to be informed of the risks and benefits of either decision. Applying this ethical principle of autonomy shows respect. It shows an aspect of respect to the patient. It also shows an aspect of respect to the autonomy of physicians and others who have a certain autonomy in making these decisions. And of course, some element of respect is due to all stakeholders that we deal with. The next fourth of these six ethical approaches, theoretical ethical approaches to making ethical decisions, has to do with relying on the character or the virtuosity, as it's sometimes called, of the pharmacist, or it could be the physician. Now, character integrity, and character, as we mentioned, is specifically mentioned, for example, in qualifications to get a license. The assumption with this theoretical approach is that the pharmacist is a moral and trustworthy person, a person of character, in other words. But, unfortunately, we know that experience proves that this is not always the case. This is not always the case. So this theoretical approach applies best when there is a trusting relationship, between the pharmacist and the patient. That this approach works the best in cases like that. And establishing a trusting relationship with patients takes time, and while it takes time to develop that trusting relationship with a patient, it can be easily lost, by doing something that makes the patient believe they can't trust you anymore. This ethical theoretical approach sometimes deals with this quotation that's here of what a moral person will ordinarily do. And what a moral person will ordinarily do is the underlying basis for this approach. This concept of what a moral person would ordinarily do is sometimes used in court cases. It's used sometimes in court cases. And it may be expressed in terms of the question, what would an ethical pharmacist do? What would an ethical pharmacist do in a case like this? So that would come up in a court case. And it assumes that the average pharmacist is ethical. And in fact, that's true. The average pharmacist is ethical, but we know that not all pharmacists are ethical. There's some few exceptions. The other aspect of this is that frequently in a court case like that, if it's a civil court case, they will bring in expert witnesses. So the expert witness who comes in will say, this is what an ethical pharmacist. The problem with expert witnesses, as Professor Spalding probably told you, is that if you pay enough money to these expert witnesses, you can get an expert witness to take either side of the argument. So you have one expert witness to say, this is what a reasonable and ethical pharmacist would do, and then there'll be another expert witness who say, no, the average pharmacist wouldn't do that, and it's up to the effectiveness of either one of those to convince the judge or the jury as to what the truth of the situation is. So some specific values that may be useful to modern pharmacists that sort of go beyond the basic values or virtues that we've talked about are listed here. So one of them is fidelity, also called commitment. And this term, this ethical virtue that goes by these titles of fidelity or commitment, has to do with promise-keeping and reliability. It has to do with promise-keeping and reliability. It has to do with straight talk. Does the patient think that you're somebody who gives straight talk, or your colleagues, in fact, the other stakeholders? And the rule here is don't make promises you can't keep. That's always a mistake, to make promises you can't keep. Fairness, another of these newer kinds of values. And this is closely related to justice. So whether we're talking about distributive justice or procedural justice, this term fairness would relate to that. Patient-centeredness is emphasized in the codes of ethics. We'll be talking about the codes of ethics, which is another theoretical approach. It's the sixth one in this list of cascade here. Patient-centeredness is emphasized in the modern codes of ethics of all of the health professions. So it's not just us in pharmacy where this is emphasized now. Evidence-based. Evidence-based means that decisions in medicine and in pharmacy should be related to good science and to professional competence. This is where professional competence comes in. This is why, for example, there's such an emphasis on controlled clinical trials, improving efficacy and safety in controlled clinical trials, because that means it's evidence-based. And this aspect of evidence-based brings into question, this whole issue of the use of dietary supplements, because we know dietary supplements have not been proven as evidence-based in controlled clinical trials. It also brings into question, ethically, the use of off-label prescribing, because off-label prescribing means you're prescribing and dispensing for an indication that has not been proven effective by the FDA yet. So it brings into question those things. It also brings into question, finally, something that's very much in the news lately, and it has to do with what is called the federal right to try legislation, the federal right to try legislation. And what this federal right to try legislation relates to is that if a patient is seriously ill with some form of cancer, maybe a terminal cancer, and they've tried a bunch of the available drugs and none of them are working, but they know that there's a certain drug in clinical trials that might work, but they're not in those clinical trials. This kind of proposal in legislative proposal that deals with right to try would say that these kind of patients should have the right to access those experimental drugs even though they're not part of a clinical trial. But this would bring into question this whole evidence-based issue, because they haven't been proven yet it's evidence-based. But for patients with no other options, this might be a good approach. But it is controversial. There's some who think this is a good idea, and there's others who think, no, it's a bad idea, and it's a diminishment of the role of the FDA in providing, ensuring safety and efficacy of drugs. So we'll have to keep an eye on that, I guess. Continuing with this talking about the fifth of the six. We're not going to get into the sixth today. We won't have time for that, but I'll say a quick word about it. The fifth theoretical approach that we want to be aware of is linking and balancing patients' rights with their corresponding duties. And this is based on the idea that's printed there that says every right comes with a corresponding duty. We like to talk in our age of time about our rights, patient rights and civil rights and whatever the rights are. But with rights also come responsibilities. And so this theory sort of tries to balance those. And I'll be giving out a handout next time that's called the NABP, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy Patients' Bill of Rights, that was printed in 1992, is still applicable. And on that handout, it's a really good example of this linking patients' rights with their responsibilities. So it lists the patient's rights, but it says then the patients also have certain responsibility. For example, they have a responsibility to adhere to the regimen and so forth. So this kind of balances paternalism and autonomy. It balances those two principles of paternalism that we talked about with autonomy. Similarly, the American Hospital Association has a document, I'm not going to be distributing it, but it's called a Patient's Bill of Rights. If you're that interested, you can look it up. And there too, it gives examples of this balancing those two things. And very importantly, this theoretical approach also, in terms of rights and duties and balancing them, has to do with the concept. It's a very ethical concept as well as one of the legal implications of this idea of living wills. The more general term is advanced directives, but people also call them living wills, and other terms that are used for these things are called durable power of attorney and medical power of attorney and so forth. 47 states, so that's clearly the majority of states, 47 states have living will laws and regulations. And most of these require, for example, that these documents be witnessed and notarized. Most of them require that these documents be written and notarized and signed by witnesses, and they're written documents and they have to be notarized. A lot of them today are written in lawyers' offices when people engage in estate planning. When people reach a certain age, and we all know that we're here for only a limited number of years, and you were concerned about, how are your assets going to be distributed to your children or to your relatives or to whomever, the charity upon your death. And so you go to a lawyer and you engage in this estate planning, and as part of that, they'll draw up these documents that we refer to as living wills or advanced directives. These are statements, these advanced directives are statements that are made by competent patients. So the idea is that when the patient writes this document, he or she is competent. They're not, mentally deranged as they might be later on when they're approaching death. And they indicate who should act as the surrogate decision maker. They indicate who should act as the patient's surrogate decision maker when they aren't able to make the decisions themselves. So if you look way down at the bottom there before number 6, it says These are documents that only become effective once the patient lacks decision-making capacity or the ability to communicate during illness. So as long as the patient is competent to speak for himself or herself and doesn't develop dementia or doesn't become too ill or unconscious and unable to communicate, these documents don't take effect until that happens, that the patient is either demented or unable, no longer viewed as medically competent. And rules governing these documents vary somewhat from state to state, as I said, and deal with issues like withdrawal of nutrition, so it'll specify. Some people will say, no, I don't want the nutrition to be withdrawn. I don't want antibiotics to be withdrawn. I want every possible means to extend my life. Others say, no way. If I'm going to die, I don't want to be hooked up to any ventilators, or I don't want artificial nutrition through a stomach tube or anything like that. So people differ quite a bit in their views, but these would all be specified in those kinds of documents. And then it talks about do not resuscitate orders and morphine infusions to hasten death. We'll talk a little bit more about those issues next time, and then we'll go on to this issue of the sixth and final way of making ethical decisions, and that's reliance on professional codes of ethics. And I will be distributing the Pharmacist Code of Ethics that we'll then discuss in some detail. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of this approach to making ethical decisions. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Kuzma if he would come down and help with us. And we'll go on to the green sheet. Actually, the next assignment is a green sheet as well for next time, so it'll be a little bit confusing. But let's look at the 6 cases there and call up the people who will be presenting these cases.
Oh.
Case today is case number 16. So for case number 16, we have the following people. We have Sue Capella, Sham Ganguly, Sindhura Janjanam, Justin Park, Roma Sharma, Andrew Tsai, and Hyo Jung Yoon.
Number 16. We have a volunteer to read case 16. Just pick up the mic and start reading it. So let's listen to case 16 so we can all get out of here at a reasonable time.
Pharmacist Ralph Levinson works in a community hospital that also operates a hospice unit. He had been following the therapy of a 56-year-old female patient who had been in the hospice unit for several weeks with terminal breast cancer with metastasis to the bone. The physician in charge of the patient initially tried to control her pain with celecoxib and other non-opioid analgesics, which helped briefly with neuropathic pain until neuropathic pain developed. At that point, the physician added a tricyclic antidepressant and PO-controlled release opioid. When breakthrough pain developed, the physician ordered immediate release PO morphine. As the cancer progressed, the pain grew worse and the patient became weaker. The physician ordered higher and higher doses of morphine to control the pain. Eventually, the doses of morphine increased to the point that alarmed pharmacist Levinson, who contacted the physician to express his concern that any further increase in the dose would cause such severe respiratory depression that it might cause the death of the patient. The physician became defensive and indicated that the patient insisted that she be maintained in a pain-free state. The physician concluded, "I realize that morphine causes respiratory depression, but that is a risk I'm willing to accept in order to respect the patient's wishes that she be in a pain-free she be as pain-free as possible. Pharmacist Levinson ponders the order for the increased dose of morphine that is before him and is deeply troubled.
Okay, let's pass the mic around and see how folks would deal with this if you were the pharmacist, if you were Ralph Levinson, or the pharmacist in this situation.
So I think this produces a ethical concern of beneficence and non-maleficence to do no harm to the patient. Increasing the dose would potentially cause death, and I don't think I'd be willing to do that.
So you might exercise your right to refuse to fill the order. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Other approaches to this. Other reactions to this.
I think it was good that the pharmacist did reach out to the doctor, but the doctor did say that he realizes it does cause respiratory depression, and this is also for a patient in the hospice unit. So I think keeping the patient comfortable and knowing that the doctor is aware makes it okay to fill the prescription.
Good. Nicely said. Mm-hmm.
Definitely a tricky situation. I think one of the things that I consider is how far along with the disease that the patient's progressed, because at that point, if they're near the end of life, then comfort would be the main thing to consider. But the pharmacist definitely has a point, because both he and the doctor have a duty to make sure that the patient isn't harmed. So it goes back to, I'm sorry.
You'd agree that this that was stated already was wise in talking to the doctor rather than just saying, I refuse to fill this. Yes. Okay.
So going back to actually what he said, it definitely is a difficult situation, considering you have to balance the harm it can cause the patient physically, but also the more psychological harm it can cause the patient. But considering, going back to I do like the point where you do have to consider how far, or it's important to consider how far along the patient is. And yeah, I think a lot of the points were already said.
Okay, a couple of people down at the end of the table didn't have a chance to comment, so let's see. We're assuming this is in a state where it's not legal to do assisted suicide, by the way. But I think it said New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken, maybe not.
I think I would bring this up with like the upper level of management in the hospital, just because this is like a conflict in opinion between two healthcare professionals.
Right.
And I feel like we need more of a patient opinion, because there wasn't really much about what the patient exactly wants out of all of this, so.
Yeah, whether the patient is in a condition where the pharmacist should talk to the patient, or whether the doctor would get upset at that, those are good questions. Certainly talking to the patient wouldn't be a bad idea. Even talking to the patient's family, if they're there, assuming the patient is beginning to be a little bit impaired, would be a good thing as well, I guess. And of course, you have to keep in mind here that if the patient does die, there could be a family member who could bring a lawsuit, about the dose of the medication. So the pharmacist should probably make a record of the fact that he or she talked to the doctor about this issue to sort of protect the pharmacist at least. Go ahead.
I think that the pharmacist has to ask the doctor if the patient is fully aware of the side effects of the medicine, and such as to reconsider the risk versus benefit ratio.
That would be a good part of the discussion. Very good points, Sal. So let me summarize, as I usually do here. In terminal patients, increasing morphine doses, they for example, a lot of times it's what they call morphine drip, where you're giving the parenteral morphine, is commonly done, and in fact, it certainly hastens the possibility of death. Sometimes it even may cause it. So you wonder, is this assisted suicide? Well, the difference is, assisted suicide is when the primary intent, where there's actually an intent to kill the patient, or to aid in dying, or whatever euphemism you use for it. But if the intent is primarily, in this case it appears to be relieving pain, realizing that a possible outcome is it's going to hasten death, then it wouldn't be in the realm of assisted suicide, and there would be fewer legal implications, although anybody can file a lawsuit. any time. But it would at least be it would be ethical to, if you're using it primarily for the purpose of pain relief. So the pharmacist would have to decide if in fact that's what's being done in this case. But you do have an ethical dilemma here, and as I said, the possibility of legal liability. The pharmacist would certainly have the legal right, he or she would have the legal right to refuse to fill the prescription, but it's not a clear-cut case here of whether it would be ethically the right thing to do. So the pharmacist should probably verify that the patient, insists on being pain-free, and that the pharmacist has talked to the doctor and all those things. Whether you would talk to the family, I think yes, in this case it would be a good idea. It would not be a violation of patient confidentiality, so this would be a good thing. Although if the pharmacist does it unilaterally, the physician might become upset with that, but the pharmacist could talk to family members, using common sense. The ethical principles here are non-maleficence certainly, empathy for the patient's desire to be pain-free, veracity, being truthful about the possible effects of the drug, and autonomy of the patient and autonomy of the physician. They would all be principles involved here. And the stakeholders, of course, are the patient, the doctor, the pharmacist, the hospital, the pharmacy department itself, all of those. Okay. So I think this is a good illustration, and we thank your classmates who had various comments all together. So let's call up the next group. Thank you, guys. Case 17.
Okay, so case 17, we have Kilat Abbas, Carl Burkhart, Hee Rong Choi, Sarah Hu, Se-Min Jin, Ralph Roa, and Amy Wang.
Other stakeholders? I got patient.
Patient, doctor, pharmacist, hospital.
Okay.
So hard to write that. Yeah, I'm not used
So
to
let's see
writing.
who wants to read this case. Whoever reads this case, in the third line, I have a typo. In the third line, where if you would eliminate the words must not, eliminate the words must not in the third line when you read the statement. That is in there as a typo. So who wants to read the story? Go ahead, please.
An oncology surgeon with a national reputation at Hackensack University Medical Center routinely administers a highly specialized blood fraction to his patients because he claims it promotes more rapid healing. This year, the use of this product will add over $1 billion to the hospital's budget at a time when the hospital continues to lose money on operations and its investment income has declined significantly due to the stock market performance. The PNT committee has been asked to review the use of this treatment, and the conclusion that has been reached based on the research and presentation by pharmacist Margaret Kraft, PharmD, states that the clinical studies do not support the routine use of this product. Dr. Kraft, an oncology clinical pharmacist, is given the daunting task of convincing the surgeon that he must stop routinely prescribing this blood fraction for all of his surgical patients. Armed with references and suggestions about less expensive options, Dr. Kraft approaches the surgeon, and after a brief polite discussion, the obviously irritated surgeon tells Dr. Kraft that he has absolutely no intention of reducing his use of this product. And if the hospital tries to force the issue, he will take his business elsewhere. Dr. Kraft reports the results of her encounter to her boss, who insists that she continue to try to persuade the surgeon to reconsider.
Okay, so if you're Dr. Kraft, let's pass the mic and see what the recommendations might be.
If I was Dr. Kraft, I would definitely talk to the surgeon again when he's not as heated. And if he continues to deny the request, I would let him walk away due to the unneeded cost of the blood fraction.
Okay. Any other ideas?
I think that if I was Dr. Kraft, I'll make a PowerPoint about the risks,
Okay, PowerPoint. There you go.
risks and benefits of this. and outweigh the costs and the clinical data about how it's not used these days.
Okay. Try to get to doctor again here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk to the doctor again, but it also depends on how upper management feels about the importance of the oncology
Very
surgeon.
important point. Very important point here.
Yeah, if it's someone who brings in more than like $1 million, it's maybe important that he stays at the hospital, but then I think they should also be aware of how these costs can be saved and used for other suitable
A really good
patients
point.
as
A
well.
really good point. Carl?
Yeah, just going off of that, I have to think that you have to potentially be prepared to call the doctor's bluff if the numbers don't add up, and in the nicest way possible, just to keep the peace in the hospital. But if the clinical data is there, I feel like a physician with that kind of experience should be receptive to that.
Very, very good point. But as your colleague right next to you stated, probably, maybe the doctor's bluffing. Maybe if you go ahead and say we're not going to allow you to use it anymore, he'll still stay at the hospital. But maybe he's not bluffing, and so you'd have to have the input of the pharmacy, of the hospital administration to say we're willing to lose this doctor. And if they're not willing, then you'll perhaps be more careful about calling his bluff. All right, go ahead.
I also agree with Amy that you should figure out, I guess, how influential this doctor is, but maybe to convince the other surgeons to not use it, and maybe that would also help convince him.
That's a good point, getting some of the other surgeons involved in it, absolutely.
I think that one of the ethical principles that must be respected is the autonomy of the physician, because he's making this decision for himself. But as Dr. Kraft, you have to have veracity and stick to your guns, and so if you believe that this therapy is unnecessary, then you have to be true to your beliefs.
Okay, really good comments by your classmates. My summary would indicate that certainly the boss wants this pharmacist to talk to the doctor again. The doctor may be willing to listen or not, PowerPoint or otherwise. He may or may not be willing to listen, but she could make a try at it. It's a possibility. No guarantee he's going to be willing to listen to it. As we indicated, I think the chief financial officer of the hospital, possibly the CEO of the hospital, need to be brought into this and say, are you willing to run the risk of this doctor taking his business elsewhere? And if they say, yeah, we're willing to call his bluff and see if he'll do that. If he takes it elsewhere, so be it. Then you're on solid ground. But if they're afraid of losing this doctor, maybe they'll say, hey, we don't like it, but we'll have to let him keep using this more expensive and unnecessary drug. You have to assess whether he's making an idle threat here or not. I think the idea of having other physicians, especially physicians in his specialty area, talk to him is a really good idea. He might be receptive to them. So some of the ethical principles here are veracity, as was pointed out, veracity, autonomy. I would say distributive justice also. Distributive justice because you're impacting the ability of the hospital to function. And obviously the stakeholders of the doctor, the pharmacist, the hospital, possibly the patients who are going to be treated with this stuff. So I think that would summarize this case well, and we thank you guys for your really good comments. The class is quite adept now, but ethics, I think, are getting more and more adept. So let's go on to case 18. And you have good instincts in general. Case 18.
Alright, so case 18, we have Rajwana Ahmed, Hida Bhagat, Kayun Kim, Minseo Kwok, Kelsey Lee, Jenna Petro, and Kristen Rizkala.
Yeah, please. Okay, let's listen to case 18.
Ken Deal, PharmD MBA, was a well-regarded director of pharmacy at a large teaching hospital, where he was also a member of the hospital's ethics committee. One morning, he received an urgent call from the physician who served as chairman of the ethics committee, asking him to report to the hospital's trauma unit for an emergency meeting of a few members of the committee to provide a consult to the physician who was the head of the trauma unit. The trauma physician excitedly explained to the members of the committee, who could get together in such a short notice, that he had a 31-year-old female who had sustained massive injuries in a motorcycle crash. The patient, who had just been transported via helicopter to the hospital, had lost a massive amount of blood and desperately needed a blood transfusion. However, the patient's husband indicated that he and his wife were devout Jehovah witnesses who, for religious reasons, firmly refused blood transfusions. The husband assured the physician that his wife felt just as strongly about this as he did. Alternative synthetic blood substitutes were a possible consideration, but the trauma doctor doubted that they would be as effective. The trauma physician, whom Ken knew well and respected, indicated forcefully that he felt an immediate blood transfusion would dramatically improve this patient's chances of survival. He felt that he would like to proceed with the transfusion despite the husband's objections. The trauma physician addressed Dr. Deal directly. Ken, I need your support on this decision to overrule the husband's objections, and I need the ethics committee's blessing to go ahead. It's an emergency situation. Dr. Deal wondered how he would respond to the trauma doctor and to the other members of the committee, 2 physicians, a nurse, and a hospital chaplain who were present.
Okay, let's hear your comments, assuming you're Ken Deal, okay?
So I think this puts him in a tough position, but I think it's important to keep the patient's autonomy in mind, especially because it could probably lead to liability issues later on if he does go along with the blood transfusion.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's it also brings in the ethical principle of veracity in terms of Dr. Deal's position that autonomy, as long as the patient and if the patient surrogate is aware of the risks and benefits, then treatment should be according to what the patient surrogate deems necessary.
I think without being able to really talk to the patient, you have to consider whether or not the husband has any sort of legal authority or like power of attorney before going along with his wishes.
Maybe he wants to get rid of his wife. It's a thought. It's a worry, right?
So I agree that the patient's autonomy should be respected, and they should go with the alternative synthetic blood substitutes, and they should document that that's the reason why they didn't give them the original blood transfusion in case they get lawsuit issues later on.
So I know it's like a really difficult situation at that time, but I think they should make sure to explain calmly to the husband again, like what the risk versus benefit is with that, and then also go ahead and do the alternative blood transfusion, because I think saving the patient is more important.
I'm not exactly sure like what the legality of it is, but I feel like if the wife herself couldn't like give consent to which medication she wanted, the husband's word would trump anything else, because he is the husband, like the family is the major proponent, so I would think that we would have to respect the husband's decision, to be honest.
Yeah, all good points, and certainly you've all pointed out that this is a clear ethical dilemma here. So we have one of your classmates who wants to add to this. I'll let him do it, and then I'll try to summarize quickly.
I just had a question about if the patient had any advance directives or a will for this.
Yeah, that's a good point. If there is an advance directive or a will that the husband could produce, obviously the patient's probably not in a position to do that. That would be a very good point, and we just ended up talking about living wills and so forth. So if that's available, that would really be helpful. And usually they would probably ask the husband about that. I did check. This is not a religion that I'm an expert in, but I did check, and this particular religion does have a very definite requirement that any blood products not be administered. That's part of their religious beliefs, for whatever it's worth. So anyway, in summarizing this, and you've all made very good points, I would say that Ken should agree to meet with the head of trauma and the other doctors, as well as the ethics committee members. So Ken shouldn't say, hey, I'm not available, just to try to get out of this ethical dilemma here. He should agree to meet with them. And it points out the point that I probably haven't made before, but all hospitals have to have an ethics committee, and some pharmacists, like Ken here, may, in some cases, serve as a member of those ethics committees. So all hospitals have to have ethics committees today. That's not something that's optional. Ken should probably inquire if further discussions with the husband are futile. So, you know, is it trying to talk to him futile? Based on what I have read about this religion's beliefs, probably it would be futile. You want to verify that the patient is not communicative. Another significant issue here would be to find out if this couple has children. Because if they have dependent children, particularly at a young age, this could put a whole new picture on this. And in a case like that, the hospital and the doctors here and the ethics committee might be justified in going to a judge very quickly and getting a court order. You could actually get a court order to say, particularly despite their religious convictions, based on the needs of these children who are dependents of these people, we feel that we need to use this procedure that is greatly going to increase the chances of her not dying. So that would be a possibility. All these things are tricky. And the other thing, you should involve the hospital's legal person, the hospital's lawyer or whatever legal authority they have at the hospital, to give some legal advice, because clearly, however this goes, whether the patient dies or whether the patient lives, and you give the blood transfusion, there could be legal challenges. So the principles involved here are certainly non-maleficence of the patient, autonomy, and the stakeholders. The stakeholders are the hospital. The hospital is certainly a stakeholder here. The patient, the husband, any children, if there are children, and then the pharmacists, the doctors involved, and the members of the ethics committee. All of those people would be stakeholders as well. So great, again, good comments, and we'll move on to case 19.
Okay, so for case 19, we have Jasmine Ashur, Rebecca Gorgel, Kelly Jang, Flower Lee, Jane M., Sarah Sanchez, and Soham Shukla.
Okay, who wants to do the honors of reading this case? Okay, go ahead.
Pharmacist Priyanka Patel is the clinical pharmacist for the large rehab division of a large community hospital in Edison, New Jersey. Priyanka has been monitoring the meds of patient M.O., a 38-year-old Caucasian male who had been in a serious motorcycle accident in which he sustained bilateral leg and arm fractures and a closed head injury, among others. He had been transferred to the rehab unit from a university hospital in New Brunswick, where the patient had been taken by helicopter to a level 1 trauma center, where the patient had been treated for an extended period after he had regained consciousness. Emma was finally about to be released from the rehab facility, but he refused to move in with his parents or siblings as social work had recommended. Instead, he insisted that he go back to his apartment, which he referred to as his bachelor pad, and resume independent living. Priyanka wanted to be sure that Emma would be competent to follow his medication regimen safely and effectively once on his own and living alone. She knew that Emma had progressed through rehab with some difficulty, exhibiting agitation, persistent memory loss, short attention span, impaired awareness, and clinical depression. His discharge meds include lorazepam, oxycodone, lisinopril, and venlafaxine. In reviewing Emma's medical record, Priyanka realizes that he has not been formally declared incompetent, nor is there any evidence that he had ever had a living will or medical power of attorney. Upon entering the patient's room, Priyanka had asked Emma if he knew where he was. Some rehab place, he answered. The pharmacist then asked if he knew what date it was, and the patient had some difficulty answering, having to refer to the calendar to figure it out. The pharmacist then began to reveal the patient's medication therapy, and the patient became agitated. When Priyanka was finished and asked Mo if he had any questions about his medications, he responded, "Don't you worry about it, doc. I got it all figured out." The pharmacist was not convinced that the patient was competent to know when to take the medications and how to monitor their side effects. Yes, she knew that the patient had resisted any suggestion that his family members should be recruited to help him in any way upon his release. When the pharmacist pointedly asked MO if he should take his Lysipro at the same time every day, he appeared confused and after some hesitation said, "I'm not sure." The pharmacist felt that the patient's impaired self-awareness was causing him to overestimate his ability to manage his meds, and she worried that he might get into trouble by taking too much or forgetting to take doses. She felt that a family member should be notified about this, but she knew that the patient did not want this. How should Priyanka deal with this situation?
Okay, let's share the mic.
I think as a pharmacist, I would have brought it up to the family at the end of the day, because he's not taking the medication the proper way, and it really goes in the ethical principle of non-malevolence, if I said it properly, and independence.
I would have a little bit of hesitation going to the family if she knew the patient didn't want this, but I would go back to the patient and try to maybe use maybe a teach-back method, and maybe get the patient to realize, oh, maybe I'm not up to this if I can't even know what medications I'm taking, and then ease into, do you need some help with this, and then go to the family again.
So going to the family could be a violation of patient confidentiality, right? Okay.
So I agree that the pharmacist should try other ways to get the patient to try to take the medication, such as like writing down the schedule for the patient. Also, the pharmacist could refer to healthcare professional and ask their opinion on what to do. So I think that having another conversation with the patient is definitely very important here. So maybe perhaps the pharmacist can make a compromise with the patient, saying that we can still have you living in your bachelor's pad, but maybe on a certain time of the day when you have to take the medication, the family member can come over and remind you on how to take the medication.
I think in this case, it's really important that the pharmacist talk to other professionals, and if this patient really is not competent, that it be noted in his medical record so that he can be getting the best care. I think if social work made a recommendation, they also should be involved in making sure to implement effective care when he's gone.
Right, social work an important component here, for sure.
So I agree. Since the patient is really concerned about his autonomy, perhaps the pharmacist could have another conversation and explain the importance of the medications and all the side effects that could occur with missing, or complications that could occur with missing taking doses and things like that. And also, earlier someone said creating a schedule for the patient to follow, and maybe telling the patient there are pill, like we could get pill boxes to help organize himself, and maybe help remind him if he needs to take or when to take medications.
Okay, so all really excellent comments, and let me summarize. I think I have one suggestion that didn't come up here, but we'll see. First of all, Priyanka here, the pharmacist, should, as you pointed out, consult with others. One of the persons she should consult with is the pharmacy director. She ought to talk about to the pharmacy director about this situation. She certainly should be talking to the physician involved, as you indicated, and social work. You specifically mentioned that. With regard to social work, one idea is she should seek and discuss with them the feasibility of arranging for a visiting nurse service. Social work could do that, to arrange for a visiting nurse. He doesn't want family involved, he doesn't want you to contact family, but maybe he would accept having a visiting nurse come daily or every other day or something like that. That's something that the social work sometimes can work out with the insurance providers and so forth. Talking to family members might not be ethical in the case of confidentiality. It's a tough choice here, but I would say it probably would not be, especially if he specifically said, I don't want any involvement with family. Maybe he's at war with them or who knows what. So it would violate the patient's autonomy and confidentiality. Another possibility, which is probably extreme here, would be, if all else fails, to have the patient declared incompetent. You would need a lawyer involvement to do that, but you could have a patient declared incompetent. In a case like that, then you would be able to bring in other family members. So all of those are possibilities. But I think, to me, the idea of talking to social work, seeing if we can get a visiting nurse to come in would be good. So as you guys pointed out, the ethical principles here: beneficence, non-maleficence, confidentiality, autonomy. I would add empathy for this guy who clearly has his problems. The stakeholders are the patient, the pharmacist, the doctor, the hospital, which is, liable, the hospital, and the family members. All of them are stakeholders, okay? So good contributions, and let's go to the last case and call up the last group. Now, case 20. It's hard to believe we've done 20 cases already.
For case 20, we have Rohan Chatela, Robert DeJong, Andreas D-I-R-M-B-I-T-I-S, Sojung Lee, Yeonhu Sung, Jitin Raisi, and Helen Wang.
Alright, I guess I'll just start. A regular patient, Mr. Smith, presents pharmacist Lois Baker with her to get a refill on his prescription for amoxicillin capsules. Lois confirms that Mr. Smith has been taking the amoxicillin as directed and suspects that he may not be benefiting from the prescribed antibiotic and may require a different therapy. Lois decides to call the physician, Dr. Fleming, to discuss her concern that the patient may not be benefiting from the amoxicillin. The receptionist who answers the phone explains that Dr. Fleming is very busy with patients and cannot take the pharmacist's call. Lois persists, insisting that it is important for her to speak with the doctor. The receptionist puts Lois on hold, and after a lengthy delay, Dr. Fleming's nurse comes on the line and asks the pharmacist, "What's the problem?" Lois begins to patiently explain the situation, but she is rather quickly cut off by the nurse who interrupts. "Oh, you just want a refill? That's all right. Just go ahead and refill the prescription." Lois repeats firmly, "Nurse, may I please speak to the doctor?" The nurse replies, "I'm sorry, that's not possible. Just go ahead and refill the prescription." Then the line goes dead. How should the pharmacist proceed, keeping in mind the ethical and practical implications?
I think that in this moment, it's pretty important that the pharmacist, she doesn't become frustrated and show her impatience, because it's pretty clear that the nurse is already kind of being short with her. So I guess that the best thing to do would just be to call the receptionist again and try to explain in a calm way that, "Oh, well, I spoke to the nurse, but she didn't seem very helpful, so it would be really great if I could speak to the doctor."
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Definitely take 5, calm down, and then call back. And basically just, if you can't get in touch with the doctor, just leave a message for the doctor, have the receptionist take the message and give that to the doctor. And then usually the doctor will call back pretty quickly, and then just explain the situation to the patient. Obviously the doctor has other patients to take care of as well.
Or maybe doctor doesn't call them back ever, maybe tell the patient about the situation, and maybe the patient can go to other doctor to get and explain to the doctor about I tried amoxicillin and amoxicillin didn't work. Can I try another prescription for that?
So I think that basically the pharmacist could leave a message with the doctor. Also maybe the doctor has a physician assistant or somebody who the pharmacist could instead talk to it. But I think here it's best to leave a message.
I also think the patient could maybe call his doctor, and maybe the nurse will be more responsive to the request to talk to the doctor himself rather than trying to call. And I think the pharmacist has to refuse at this moment in time, because if it's not going to benefit the patient, then he should hold up until he gets a right answer.
Okay, good, all good comments. And my sort of final summary here. I think, the possibility of still ultimately talking to this doctor should be considered, but it doesn't look too promising to me. It looks like that there's going to be resistance there. So probably the best approach here, at least right at that moment, is for the pharmacist to, in a calm way, again, I like the way you said calm down a little bit here, but in a calm way to have a discussion with the patient, to verify that this antibiotic is not helping. For example, or it's not improving the situation. You know, talk to the patient about, you know, are you getting any, you've been taking the whole first course, the first prescription of this antibiotic, is whatever was bothering you getting better, or is there no effect at all that seems to be occurring here? And if that's the case, if the patient seems to verify that the thing is ineffective based on, you know, the pharmacist's discussion and perception, it might be good then to suggest that the patient contact the doctor. You could say, I, you know, try to contact the doctor's not available, see if you can get through, and see if possibly a different approach might be helpful. A different approach would be a way to say it. Or you could come out and say maybe a stronger antibiotic or something like that. But you need to do it carefully. You'd have to be careful at how you do this. You want to do it in a way, even though at this point you're kind of ticked off about the doctor not talking to you, but you want to probably have a discussion with the patient in a way that's not hypercritical of the MD. You know, you want to say, your doctor is obviously incompetent or you know, not prescribing an effective drug here. So you do it in a way that would not overly, so that you don't want the patient to be calling the doctor and saying the pharmacist made all these statements, because there could be even legal repercussions there. You could even suggest, if the discussion with the patient goes on, that, you know, if this antibiotic doesn't seem to be working, that maybe you could suggest to the doctor about the possibility of doing a culture sensitivity test to see if the drug is effective or some other drug might be more effective. You might even say, if this goes on and you're not getting resolved, whatever your problem is, maybe you'd have to talk to an ID specialist or something like that. So talking to the patient is probably, in a case like this, the issue, the best approach, given that the doctor doesn't seem willing to come on the phone and have a discussion with the pharmacist. The pharmacist could here, legally, refuse to fill the prescription based on those bases for refusal. You could here. I don't know if I would refuse to fill it. If the patient really seems to want to get it refilled and maybe continue until you can get this resolved, taking it, I would probably refill it, but you could have the right to not refill it as well. So the stakeholders here are the patient, the pharmacist, and the doctor. The pharmacy also, which would be affected by incurring the ire of this doctor, or even the possibility of a legal approach. And the ethical principles, again, are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy of the physician, certainly, empathy for the patient's situation, empathy, and veracity. The pharmacist has to be truthful about, you know, concerns that this drug isn't working. Any other comments? Okay, thanks all you guys for your attention.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm gonna run upstairs. Thanks, Mike. Where's the event? 249. 249. Upstairs. You'll see.